I used to think fear arrived suddenly, like a door kicked open, like sirens, like shouting. I was wrong. Fear arrived quietly. It learned my schedule. It memorized the sounds of my building. It waited until night, when everything feels heavier and the mind has nowhere to run. That night started like any other. Dinner reheated. Phone on the table. The hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that warned me my entire sense of safety was about to crack. But something felt off. Not panic. Not yet. Just a tension in the air, like the room was holding its breath. I checked my phone again. No new messages. No alerts. Still, I could not relax. When you live long enough with uncertainty, your body learns to react before your mind does. I turned off one light, then another. Not to sleep. That is something people never understand until they live it. You do not hide because you are guilty. You hide because visibility feels dangerous. I sat on the couch in the dark, fully dressed, shoes still on. Not because I planned to go anywhere, because taking them off felt like committing to staying. Outside, a car slowed down, not stopped. Ghost? Es lo es. Primera. Frost? Eh? My heart started beating so hard I was afraid the sound might travel through the walls. I held my breath, counting seconds, without realizing I was doing it. Nothing happened. The car moved on. The street went quiet again. That should have been the end of it. A false alarm. A moment of paranoia. But once fear wakes up, it does not go back to sleep easily. My phone vibrated. I flinched so hard, my chest hurt. A message from a group chat I barely spoke in anymore. People sending short lines. Fragments. No full explanations. They are in the area. Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone. Nobody said who. Nobody at the... I stared at the screen, the words glowing faintly in the dark, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not new. The rumors. Stories. The warnings passed quietly from one person to another like contraband. But this time felt different. This time, it felt close. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, careful not to make a sound. I moved the curtain just enough to see the street below. Nothing unusual. Street lights, empty sidewalks, a world pretending to be normal. That is the cruelest part. Everything looks the same right before your life changes. I stepped back and leaned against the wall, my mind racing backward instead of forward. I remembered the day I arrived here, how the air smelled different, how everything felt louder and faster. I remembered telling myself this was temporary, that one day I would feel settled. Years passed. I built routines. I built relationships. I built a version of myself that almost forgot how fragile it all was. Almost. The phone vibrated again. Another message. Longer this time. They took someone 2 blocks away. No names. No details. Just enough to let fear finish the sentence on its own. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to my chest. My thoughts started spiraling, each one darker than the last. What if they came here? What if someone knocked? What if I froze? What if everything I worked for ended tonight? I realized something then. I had spent years trying to be invisible, believing that if I stayed small enough, the world would pass me by. But fear does not care how quiet you are. It finds you anyway. I checked the door. Locked. Checked it again. I walked through my apartment slowly, noticing things I had never paid attention to before. The crack in the wall near the kitchen, the chair with the loose leg I never fixed, the plant by the window that somehow stayed alive no matter how much I neglected it. It hit me that this place, this ordinary space, held my entire life, and it could be taken without warning. Another sound outside. Voices this time, not loud. Muffled. Too close. I turned off my phone, not because I did not want information, because I could not handle any more. I sat in the dark and listened. Every sound became a threat. Footsteps, keys, a door somewhere in the building opening and closing. I thought about my family. About how far away they were, about how they still believed I was safe because I always told them I was. I wondered what I would say if this was the last normal night I ever had, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time stretched until it stopped making sense. At some point I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, from adrenaline. I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes. I told myself to stay calm. That panic would only make things worse. But calm is a luxury when uncertainty is breathing down your neck. That was the moment I understood something I had been avoiding for years. I was not afraid of what might happen. I was afraid of how powerless I felt. I had built my life around endurance, around waiting, around hoping the storm would pass without touching me. But storms do not work like that. Outside, a door slammed. Closer now. I opened my eyes. Whatever was happening, it was no longer far away. And as I sat there in the dark, heart racing, listening to sounds I could not control, one thought cut through everything else. If this was the night everything changed, I would not let fear be the last thing that defined me, because surviving is one thing, but living in constant fear is another kind of loss entirely, and I was done pretending they were the same. That was the problem. Silence can be louder than impact when you are waiting for something you cannot see. I stayed on the floor long after my legs went numb, listening to the building breathe. Pipes clicked. Somewhere above me, water ran. Normal sounds, pretending nothing was wrong. I checked the time and realized an hour had passed without me noticing. Fear bends time until minutes feel like threats and seconds feel like decisions. I stood up slowly and paced the apartment, careful not to let my footsteps echo. I told myself I needed control. Something solid. Something real. I made tea I would not drink. I washed a cup that was already clean. My hands needed a task so my mind would not betray me. My phone stayed face down on the table, powered off. Not ignorance. Self-preservation. At some point, the adrenaline dipped, and in that dip came clarity. The kind that hurts. the kind that forces questions you have been postponing for years. What was my plan? If this did not pass, what was my plan? If tonight was not just a scare? I realized I did not have one. I had always believed endurance was enough. Keep your head down. Stay consistent. Do not draw attention. But endurance without direction is just waiting to be found. I leaned against the counter and stared at the door. It looked the same as it always had. Cheap paint, small scratch near the handle. Nothing about it suggested danger, yet my chest tightened every time I imagined it opening. I remembered a conversation from months earlier, a friend telling me, quietly, almost apologetically, "You cannot live forever, hoping nobody notices you exist." I had laughed it off then. I was not laughing now. Another sound drifted through the hallway. Voices again. Lower. Closer. I could not make out words, only the weight of them. I held my breath and counted heartbeats, the way you do when you are trying not to panic in public. The voices moved past my door. I stayed frozen long after they were gone. That was when my phone buzzed against the table. I had forgotten to turn off vibrations. The sound felt like an alarm in a library. I lunged for it, silencing it instantly, pulse exploding in my ears. One missed call, one voicemail, no name, just a number. I stared at it for a long time before listening. The voice was calm. Too calm. Neutral in a way that made my skin crawl. A message asking for a return call regarding a matter of interest. No threats. No urgency. Just enough ambiguity to let my imagination finish the job. I deleted it without responding. That single act felt heavier than any conversation could have, because deleting it meant acknowledging something I did not want to say out loud. The situation was no longer theoretical. I sat down at the table and finally turned the phone back on fully. Messages flooded in. Short updates. Locations. Rumors stacked on top of rumors. Fear traveling faster than facts. People disappearing from the chat. Accounts going silent. The digital equivalent of doors closing. I scrolled until my eyes burned, until the words stopped meaning anything. Then I locked the screen and pressed my forehead against the table. I thought about how fragile normal life really is. How quickly it can flip from routine to survival without warning. One day you are planning your week. The next, you are measuring silence and shadows. I stood and went to the window again, this time without pulling the curtain. I let myself look. The street was still quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that does not calm you, but makes you suspicious of everything. I noticed details I had never cared about before. A parked van that had not been there earlier. The way a streetlight flickered like it could go out at any second. The feeling that the city had shifted slightly off its axis. I stepped back and exhaled slowly. I knew then that waiting was no longer an option. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. Waiting had kept me alive, but it had also kept me trapped, and fear thrives in traps. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. I was not sure what I was looking for. Answers, options, proof that I still had agency. What I found instead were memories, photos, emails, pieces of a life I had built quietly, believing that effort alone would protect it. I realized something uncomfortable. If I lost this place tomorrow, there were people who would never know where I went. Not because they did not care, but because I had learned to exist without leaving footprints. That invisibility had once felt like safety. Now it felt like erasure. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Are you okay?" I did not answer right away. The question felt too big. How do you explain a fear that has no single soul? How do you say that everything familiar suddenly feels temporary? I typed one word, "fine," then deleted it. I typed another, "still here," then erased that too. Finally, I sent nothing. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, letting the weight of the moment settle. The truth pressed in from all sides. This was no longer about hiding. It was about deciding who I was willing to become. I could stay frozen, hoping the noise moved somewhere else, or I could accept that the life I had been living required more than silence to survive. Outside, the van door opened, then closed. My stomach dropped. I did not know if it meant anything. That was the worst part. I grabbed my jacket and held it in my hands, not putting it on yet, just feeling its weight, preparing for a choice I was not ready to make. Because once you move, truly move, there is no pretending anymore. And as I stood there, heart pounding, jacket in, and one thought burned through the fear. If I stayed exactly where I was, waiting for permission to feel safe, I might never feel safe again. So I took a breath, and for the first time that night, I stopped waiting. I did not leave right away. That is important. People imagine escape as a sudden sprint. A door slammed, footsteps disappearing into the night. In reality, it starts much quieter, with hesitation, with doubt, with the unbearable weight of knowing that once you move, you cannot claim ignorance anymore. I stood in the middle of the apartment with the jacket still in my hands, listening. Nothing, no voices, no engines, no footsteps in the hall. And yet, my body was already in motion, muscles tense, senses sharp, like an animal that knows the danger is not gone just because it cannot see it. I forced myself to think, not emotionally, logically. If they were here for me, leaving in a panic could make me visible. If they were not here for me, staying could still be a mistake. Both options carried risk. That was when I realized the truth that hit harder than fear itself. I was no longer choosing between safety and danger. I was choosing between controlled risk and blind hope. Hope had kept me alive for years. Hope had also kept me unprepared. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. I did not turn on the light. I knew where everything was by memory. I pulled out a backpack from the top shelf, the one I had not used since a road trip years ago. It still smelled faintly like dust and old fabric. I laid it on the bed and stared at it. This was not running. This was repositioning. I packed slowly, maybe. Documents first. Passport. Copies I had scanned months ago and never thought I would need urgently. Cash I had hidden for emergencies I never wanted to imagine. A charger. One change of clothes. Nothing sentimental. That was the hardest part. I picked up a photo frame from the dresser, a moment frozen in time when everything still felt stable. I put it face down and left it there. If I started choosing memories, I would not finish packing. My phone buzzed again. This time, I did not jump. A message from someone I trusted. Short. Direct. They are checking apartments near the station. 2 units already cleared. B. Careful. My throat went dry. Cleared. That word does something to you when you understand what it really means. I typed back one word. Where? The reply came fast. Too fast. 3rd Street. Blue van? 2 agents. Maybe more. My heart started racing again, but now it had direction. 3rd Street was 2 blocks away. I walked to the window and looked down. The van was still there, parked, engine off, like it was waiting for something or someone. I zipped the backpack shut. That sound felt final. I slipped on my jacket and stood by the door, hand hovering near the lock. This was the moment, the last second of stillness before everything changed. I thought about how strange it is that doors look the same whether you are leaving for groceries or leaving a life behind. I unlocked it slowly. No clicks. No mistakes. The hallway was empty. I stepped out and closed the door without letting it latch loudly. My heart was beating so hard I was afraid it would echo off the walls. Every step toward the stairwell felt like a gamble. I avoided the elevator. Never trust an enclosed space when you are trying to disappear. The stairwell smelled like concrete and old cleaning chemicals. I moved quickly but quietly, counting floors in my head, grounding myself in numbers so panic would not take over. By the time I reached the ground floor, my palms were slick with sweat. I paused before pushing the door open. This was the point of no return. I opened it and stepped outside. The air felt colder than before, sharper. The streetlights cast long shadows that made everything look stretched and unreal. I walked in the opposite direction of the van, head down, pace steady, trying to look like someone who belonged exactly where they were. Every car that passed made my shoulders tighten. Every sudden sound felt like a signal. Halfway down the block, I heard it. A door slam. Not close, but not far. I did not turn around. Turning around is how you get remembered. I reached the corner and slowed just enough to glance at the reflection in a dark storefront window. I looked normal, boring, invisible. Just another person walking late at night with a backpack. Good. I crossed the street and kept going, choosing routes that avoided cameras I had memorized over time. Small habits I never thought would matter suddenly became lifelines. At the next intersection, headlights swept across the pavement behind me. I felt it before I heard it. A vehicle slowing. I did not run. Running confirms fear. Instead, I turned casually into a convenience store and pretended to browse. I picked up a bottle of water I did not need and stood near the fridge, pretending to read labels while watching reflections in the glass. The headlights stopped outside. The engine idled. Seconds stretched. I forced myself to breathe evenly, then the engine revved. The vehicle pulled away. I waited another full minute before leaving the store. By the time I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my legs felt hollow, like they were carrying someone else. That was when it hit me. This was not a one-night escape. This was the beginning of a different way of living, one where you cannot afford to be careless, one where safety is something you build, not something you assume. I walked until my phone vibrated again. Another message. You need to be off-grid tonight. No familiar places. I stopped under a streetlight and stared at the words. Off-grid. That phrase sounds dramatic until you realize it simply means being unreachable. I turned my phone off. Completely. The silence that followed was heavier than before. But it was chosen this time, and choice changes everything. I adjusted the backpack on my shoulders and started walking again, deeper into the city, toward places I had never needed before. As I disappeared into the darkness between streetlights, one thought settled in with chilling clarity. I had escaped the first net, but I had no idea how many more there were. Night changes the city, not just the light. The rules. During the day, movement blends into routine. At night, every choice feels exposed. Every decision echoes longer than it should. I walked for almost an hour without checking the time. I measured distance by my breathing, by the burn in my calves. By the way, my thoughts stopped racing and started narrowing. Survival does that. It strips life down to what matters in the next 5 minutes. I found a place to sit beneath an overpass, where traffic roared overhead like a constant distraction. Noises cover. Silence gets you noticed. I leaned back against the concrete pillar and finally allowed myself to breathe deeply. That was my first mistake. The moment I stopped moving, the fear caught up. My hands started shaking. Not from cold, from the release. My body had been running on borrowed adrenaline, and now it wanted payment. I pressed my palms together hard, grounding myself, reminding myself I was still here, still free. For now, I did not turn my phone back on. I did not check messages. I did not want new information unless I absolutely needed it. Too much knowledge can paralyze you just as fast as ignorance. I stayed there until the sky shifted from deep black to that muted gray blue that comes before dawn. That strange hour when the city feels unfinished, when night workers go home and day workers have not yet arrived. I stood and adjusted the straps of my backpack. I needed a plan. Not a perfect one, just one that lasted longer than hope. I avoided familiar areas, places tied to memory, pull you back emotionally, and emotion makes you predictable. I moved toward a part of the city I had only passed through before, where faces changed often and nobody looked twice at someone new. By mid-morning, exhaustion crept in, the kind that makes your thoughts blur. At the edges, I bought cheap food with cash and ate standing up, watching reflections instead of people. I stayed moving, but slower now, more deliberate. Then I felt it again. That sensation. Being watched. There was no sound. No obvious sign. Just a pressure at the base of my skull, like instinct tapping me on the shoulder. I crossed the street. The pressure followed. I stopped suddenly and pretended to tie my shoe, using the storefront glass to scan behind me. Pedestrians passed. Cars idled. Nothing obvious. But instinct does not lie without reason. I stood and kept walking, heart steady but alert. I counted breaths. I counted steps. I focused on being ordinary. Then I heard my name. Not shouted, not called. Spoken. Softly. I froze. Nobody says your name by accident. I did not turn around. I walked faster. Footsteps matched mine. Not rushing, not chasing, just keeping pace. My chest tightened. I turned the next corner sharply and ducked into a crowded bus stop just as a bus pulled in, doors hissing open. I boarded without thinking, paid in cash, and moved toward the back, blending into bodies and backpacks and tired faces. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. I watched the sidewalk through the grimy window as it passed by. No one followed. I did not relax. I stayed on that bus longer than I needed to, changed routes twice, got off and waited, boarded another, movement without pattern, time without anchors. By afternoon, I found a place I could disappear for a few hours. Not a destination, a pause. I sat and stared at nothing, letting my body catch up to my mind. That was when the reality settled in deeper than fear. I could not go back. Not tomorrow. Not after things cooled down. Not after explanations. The version of my life where I assumed safety had already ended. I turned my phone back on briefly. Messages flooded in. Missed calls, panic, warnings, rumors. I scrolled just enough to understand one thing. This was not random. This was not paranoia. They were expanding. My name was not confirmed. But it did not need to be. All it took was one wrong interaction, one familiar face, one careless moment. I powered the phone off again. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, and stared at the floor. This was the point where people break, not during the chase, not during the fear, but here, in the waiting. I thought about everything I had built, every compromise, every sacrifice made under the assumption that tomorrow would look like today. I had been wrong. And then something shifted. Not panic, not anger, clarity. If I stayed frozen between what I was and what I needed to become, fear would win. I had to move forward, not hus awa. Primera, stood up. I was done reacting. I needed to choose a direction, not safety, not comfort. Control. I adjusted my backpack one last time that day and stepped back into the stream of people, no longer running blindly, but moving with intention. As the sun dipped low and the city prepared for another night, one truth settled into me with quiet certainty. I was no longer just escaping something. I was becoming someone they would never recognize again. The second night felt different. Not louder, not calmer, sharper. Like every sound had edges now. Every shadow felt intentional. I moved through the city with a purpose I did not have before, but purpose does not erase danger. Sometimes it attracts it. I followed the plan I built quietly in my head. No calls, no digital trails. No places tied to my past. I chose distance over comfort, anonymity over speed. By midnight, I was far enough that the streets felt unfamiliar even to me. That was the point. I found a place to rest where no one lingered long. I did not sleep deeply. I slept in fragments, 10 minutes here, 15 there. Every time my eyes closed, my body stayed half awake, ready to move. At some point before dawn, I heard sirens, not close, but not far. I stayed still. Sirens mean nothing by themselves. Panic turns them into monsters. I waited until they faded, counting my breathing again, grounding myself in the present. When the sky began to lighten, I moved. Morning crowds are useful. People are focused on schedules, not strangers. I blended into that rhythm, walking like I belonged, carrying myself like someone with somewhere to be. I did not rush. Rushing is how you get noticed. I made my final move before noon. A small choice on paper, a massive one in reality. I crossed a line I never thought I would. Not geographically, but psychologically. I let go of the version of me that expected fairness. I stopped believing that explaining myself would save me. I stopped believing that staying quiet would protect me. I stopped believing that the system would sort things out if I just stayed patient. I chose survival without apology. By the afternoon, I was somewhere new. Not safe. Just different. Different enough to breathe. I checked my reflection in a window. Same face. Same eyes. But something behind them had hardened. Not cruelty. Resolve. I understood something then that most people never have to learn. Freedom is not a place. It is a state of constant awareness. You do not relax into it. You defend it every day. I did not celebrate. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady, and steady was enough. That night, I finally slept for real. Not long, but deeply enough to dream. Not about fear. Not about running. I dreamed about silence. Weeks later, I would hear stories. Raids. Detentions. Names whispered. Streets that went quiet overnight. I would recognize pieces of what I escaped, like echoes of a storm I felt pass just behind me. Sometimes guilt surfaced, not because I did anything wrong, but because others did not get the same warning. Not everyone hears the moment when danger knocks softly. I did. And I listened. I do not tell this story to scare you. I tell it because fear is already there for many people. What they lack is awareness. If there is one thing this experience carved into me, it is this. Do not wait for permission to protect your life. Do not assume tomorrow is guaranteed, and never confuse silence with safety. Because the moment you think it cannot happen to you is usually the moment it already has. If this story made you pause, reflect, or question how fragile normal life really is, stay with this channel. These are not just stories, they are warnings, lessons, and reminders from lives that changed overnight. And there is another story waiting.